Thanks so much. Thank you, Will, and the Race Ethics Power Project, and University of Toronto. It's really my pleasure and honor to be here. So without further ado, for many, the year 2020 was amongst the worst in recent US history. So there was COVID, pandemic, an impending presidential election, and at the same time, there was unprecedented mass unrest in response to the murder of George Floyd by the Minneapolis Police Department, a more broadly transgenerational problem of systemic racism and racial inequality in the US. But 2020 was also the year that the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist Isabel Wilkerson published a new book entitled Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents. But in it, she made a straightforward but controversial argument, which is that if we want to understand racial inequality in the United States, not only in 2020, but in its history writ large, we need to recognize that the country is and always has been a caste system. Her claim was breathtaking in scope and delivered in prose that were both elegant and expertly calibrated to entice a mass readership. In other words, the book was predestined to become a bestseller. In a time riven by racial despair and frustration, it offered the reading public a ready-made answer for their discontents. Still, the book did not achieve acclaim in all circles. So race scholars who reviewed it critiqued it with an intensity matched only by the bombast with which the publishing industry advertised it. Caste does not explain race, as Professor Charisse Burden-Stelly would put it cuttingly in an influential 2020 essay for the Boston Review. What she meant, more specifically, was both that Wilkerson's book could not explain racial inequality, either today or ever, and that there is little place for the concept of caste in the analysis of American anti-Black racism. As she explained, Wilkerson's caste thesis was basically a recapitulation of the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal's and the early 20th century caste school of race relations theses that developed in cohort. So this was a group of sociologists and anthropologists who contend that caste, rather than race or class, was the source of Black inequality. And by the 1940s, Burden-Stelly pointed out, the work of this aspiring caste school had already been soundly refuted by the sociologist Oliver Cromwell Cox. And since Cox's critiques had never been answered, they applied just as well to Wilkerson as they had to Myrdal and his friends. So indeed, Burden-Stelly argued Wilkerson had basically followed Myrdal in asserting caste as a kind of, quote, shorthand for all forms of subjection emanating from systems of caste, class, and racism, regardless of history, context, geography, and form, unquote. And in reducing caste ultimately to a matter of, quote, tradition, custom, attitude, and feeling, unquote. And as a result, she further contended, Wilkerson's book ultimately led to implausible conclusions, especially the view that racial inequality was a problem better addressed by changing, quote, how we relate to one another, rather than by, quote, overhauling a global political economy rooted in the hierarchical ordering of humanity. So in other words, the point for Burden-Stelly was that talking about caste makes it difficult, if not impossible, to talk about the real problem, which is racial capitalism. And to be clear on this point, her critique was not that talk about caste turns our attention to race when what we really should be talking about is class. It was something more serious, namely that the concept of caste, as applied to the United States, makes it difficult to talk about both race and class, and thus denies us our two most important categories for understanding racial inequality today. So lodged as a critique of Wilkerson's book, Burden-Stelly's are, to my mind, both effective and correct. From a theoretical perspective, there were real limitations that Burden-Stelly points out. Despite its lofty pretensions of offering a new theory of racial inequality as caste, Wilkerson's book contains no more than a cursory engagement with the many previously established modes of inquiry into the problem of racial domination. And moreover, the account of caste it offers is far less a theory per se than it is a proposition or an assertion. So Wilkerson's argument develops around a series of strikingly broad historical analogies, especially between the United States, Nazi Germany, and modern India, and anecdotes drawn from her own experiences as a successful Black woman in the United States. As the political theorist Hari Ramesh would point out in his own important review of the book, Wilkerson offered to explain American racism by way of a superficial comparison to Indian society. And while Ramesh acknowledged that there are important ways in which such analogies are and have been worthwhile, he also argued that, quote, a theory that sees American racial oppression first and foremost as a caste system cannot account for crucial differences between social inequality in South Asia and in the United States, differences with important implications for emancipatory political projects. So at the risk of piling on, I also want to add another point to Ramesh's concerns, and Burden-Stelli's, which is that Wilkerson's analogical reasoning also often took on a biological tenor. And so, for example, she says that, quote, caste is the bones while race is the skin, that caste is, quote, a human pyramid encrypted into us all, and that, quote, just as DNA is the code of instructions for cell development, caste is the operating system for economic, political, and social interaction in the United States from the time of its gestation, unquote. So this kind of language, I think, is striking to encounter today, and maybe that was exactly the point for her. But there's also, of course, a long tradition of biological metaphor in the study of race, one that people like W.E.B. Du Bois, the eminent social theorist on whom much will be said presently, did much to displace. So, for example, in the 1940 book, Dusk of Dawn, one of Du Bois's several autobiographical ventures, he remarks that the principal problem in the massively popular social science of his own time, which was the work of Herbert Spencer, is that haphazardly applies, quote, biological analogy and, quote, vast generalizations instead of, quote, facing the facts of the social situation and racial world, unquote. The Du Bois's special worry was that biological analogy may give the appearance of naturalness and scientificity to what are ultimately social phenomena, and thus, quote, lull the mind to hypnosis, as he would put it, rather than spurring it to action. What Burden-Stelli, Ramesh, and Du Bois indicate, in other words, is that analyzing the United States as a caste system and seeking to make sense of its history of racial domination, the terms thereof, can be a perilous endeavor. But the point of this talk, accordingly, will be to evaluate these dangers and to consider, moreover, whether it makes sense at all to think about racial dynamics in the United States in terms of caste. To note, this focus is also part of a current book project, which is likewise tentatively titled The Spirit of Caste, which has a much more legal focus than the talk today, but I'm happy to talk more about that during Q&A if people are interested. So here, though, like that larger project, I'm interested in thinking about the following kinds of questions. Why is there a history of talking about the United States as a caste system? Should we ultimately treat this tradition of theorization, for it is, as I shall suggest, a substantial tradition, one whose origins go to the origins of American political theory itself, as a cautionary tale, or rather approach it as something more? And if there is, in fact, something to the idea of American caste, do its benefits ultimately outweigh its burdens when we bring it to bear on our own present? So my goal in what follows today will be to convince you of the following two claims. So first, I will argue that there is, in fact, something to the idea of the United States as a caste system, and that to see why we could look to Du Bois's own arguments on the matter. And second, I will argue understanding American caste in the way that Du Bois does, which is not at all the way that Wilkerson does, is important because it reveals something about the history and present of racial inequality. And specifically, it illuminates the problem of racial inequality as one of transgenerational social immobility. Before developing these claims, I do want to briefly clarify one thing that I will not be doing. So most importantly, with apologies, because this is a talk given in Toronto, my focus is hopelessly centered on the United States. I will not. So except at the very outset and pretty superficially and with caution, be touching on caste as it exists elsewhere. And I won't also be talking about the best ways to conceptualize caste globally or sort of as such. So I'm pretty contextually focused. Instead, what I will be doing is conducting, I think, what we can think of as a three-part tour. So on the first stop, I will reintroduce you to the concept of caste with the idea of showing you why there's good reason to think about it as a relatively common political economic phenomenon. And then second, our next stop will involve a closer look at Du Bois's caste theory, which we'll do by taking a look at Black Reconstruction. And then finally, we'll come back to the present at the conclusion And I'll present some ideas about why I believe that the United States remains a caste system in the Du Boisian sense, at least. So stop number one. When one speaks of caste today, and this is something I encounter commonly when I talk to people about the book project, so most people's minds instinctively turn to South Asian society, and this makes perfect sense. Indeed, law professor Guha Krishnamurti, which I'm probably not pronouncing very well, has documented an important part of popular American social justice activism, actually coming out of 2020, has been an Indian American-led movement against explicit caste discrimination. And so a project of embodying those kinds of protections in American civil rights law. So when we look at caste as a broader historical phenomenon, though, it quickly becomes clear that the story is somewhat more complicated. So the anthropologist Nicholas Dirks points this out in his important 2001 book, Castes of Mind, which argues that even in South Asia, caste, quote, is not in fact some unchanged survival of ancient India, unquote, but rather a legacy of institutions and discourses tracing to what he calls an historical encounter between India and Western colonial rule. So a key point for Dirks is that when the British colonists and European Orientalists set out to understand and thus better exploit the peoples they encountered in South Asia, they largely drew upon schemata that were sort of lying already ready to hand in their own culture. So Europe's own self-narratives. So telling examples of this tendency may be found in writings of people like James Mill, the infamous British utilitarian imperialist who wrote volubly on Indian history to support the colonial exploits of the East India Tea Company. And for him, and here I'll read sort of a lengthy passage just to give you sort of a sense of the sort of popular idea of caste that was emerging at this time. So for him, quote, the institutions of caste may be traced in places with which we being his Anglophone readership, are intimately connected. In the ancient condition of our Saxon ancestors, they were divided into four great classes. First, the artificers and tradesmen. Second, the husbandmen. Third, those who exercise the honorable profession of arms. And fourth, the clergy. This distribution is accordingly to be found not only in all the European nations formed upon the ruins of the Roman Empire, but in other ages and in very distant parts of the globe. The ancient inhabitants of Egypt are said to have been divided into a clergy, military people, the husbandmen, and the artificers. The establishment of the four great castes in the country of Indostan, which is the British Orientalist term for India, is precisely of the same nature. So what Mill believed himself to be looking at when he examined Indian society, in other words, was Europe's own past. This in turn created an argument in favor of colonization, which Mill, along with many other 19th century Europeans, would justify as an act of benevolent modernization. But introducing the colonized peoples to capitalism, or in so introducing them, it would be commonly claimed Europeans could help them break free of their traditional ties, emancipating them from their inherited professions so that they could pursue alternatives of their own choosing. The theory of caste that Mill emphasized, thus, was an occupational one. The idea being that a caste system at base is a hereditary division of labor. Now, the idea that the complexities of any society, European or other, could be reduced to the kind of fourfold distinction that Mill draws has been the subject of wide and well-justified criticism. But it is also true that many societies throughout history have used the principle of heredity to divvy up and naturalize the world of social reproduction. And in this limited sense, I think that Mill's observation, though certainly not the colonial implications he would draw from it, is somewhat apt. So I think it's fair to say some of the feudal arrangements that characterized Europe between the 9th and 15th centuries rendered it a caste society in this occupational sense. In that context, every person's primary ties, so to themselves, to others, to property, to their role in the social enterprise, was established by their natal status. Thus, as the legal scholar Joseph Singer would put it, quote, rather than citizens of equal status entering contracts with each other, feudal England confronts us as a society in which each person's station in life was set by his or her status, a society defined by lords, commoners, and serfs, by bishops, priests, monks, by wives, sisters, daughters, and nuns. And in Europe, as the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm argues, this was a condition that rising capitalism tended to displace, as it increasingly rendered, quote, birth and origin of less importance than wealth, unquote, in the determination of social stratification. So what Mill evidently downplays, I think, is the extent to which the major European empires actually imposed this principle of heredity on the peoples they colonized. While Dirks points this out with regard to what the British did in India, the historian Maria Elena Martinez demonstrates that a similar dynamic was at play in Spain's colonial exploits in the Americas. As she shows, the genealogical origins of caste, the term tracing to the Latin castus, which translating most directly to English words like chaste or chastity, goes to the idea of religious purity. During the 15th century, on her telling, Christians on the Iberian Peninsula would develop an ideology of blood purity marked by the association of caste or casta with raza or race. The sistema de castas they would later impose on the colonized people of present-day Mexico entailed a racialized division of labor, one that organized nobility, whiteness, and European ancestry at the top, people of mixed descent, who incidentally came to be called castos, in the middle, and people of indigenous and African descent at the bottom. So I'm raising these brief examples from the history of European colonization because I think it's crucial context for a more informed discussion of caste with respect to the United States. What we should draw from these examples is not that caste is a phenomenon that has existed in all times and all places. Rather, what they suggest, though, is that caste has existed in different and contextually specific ways according to different colonial experiences, and that at least in the occupational sense, caste has deep roots in European history. And insofar as the origins of the United States are also part of that story of European history and colonization, we should hence not necessarily be surprised to find that caste in a specific way is part of American history too. In what follows, I want to explore what caste was and is in the United States, beginning with the account that Du Bois provides in his 1935 book, Black Reconstruction in America. From the perspective he offers, it made good sense to analyze the United States as a caste system. And this was not so much because caste provided him with a powerful analogy, but because it was appropriate, I think, to the subject matter he hoped to explain. Now we'll move to stop 2 on our tour. As the philosopher and Du Bois scholar Robert Gooding Williams has argued, any inquiry into Du Bois's thought must take seriously as a kind of first principle Du Bois's own self-perception of his life's work as a project conducted on behalf of people of color the world over, with special attention to the plight of African Americans in the United States. By the end of his long life, which is, I think, almost a century long, Du Bois had devoted decades to teaching in Black American universities and to civil rights advocacy as a leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and at the same time contributed decades of written work, sort of a virtual library of genre-defined writings, which include something like 21 published books. So this is like a tiny snippet to look at Black Reconstruction. But anyone who dives into the world of Du Bois will find him claiming with a pretty high degree of regularity that the United States is a caste system. So in analyzing the descriptions of American caste he offers in Black Reconstruction, I'm examining a sort of small fragment of what he has to offer with this broader sample. But I've chosen Black Reconstruction for a specific purpose. And in part, it's because there's been a sort of recent renaissance around this work in particular in American popular culture. So increased attention to this book in recent years, I think, has been motivated in no small part by the more general movement to reckon with the country's history of anti-Black racism. And so Black Reconstruction in many ways, at least in scholarly circles, I think has come to sort of function as a guidebook for asking these kinds of questions. And so the book itself considers the role of African Americans in the Civil War and in Reconstruction, and it presents several astute theories explaining why the abolition of slavery did not abolish racism or racial inequality itself. So since 2020, scholars across the social sciences and humanities have turned to Black Reconstruction to argue that racial inequality persists today because of capitalism. And indeed, one of the key arguments Du Bois' book suggests is that in United States history, racism and capitalism have been mutually reinforcing phenomena. Throughout the 19th century, he argues, racism flouted the possibility of a multiracial labor movement, which he associates with the idea of achieving an abolition democracy. This is the idea that white laborers allied with white capital to protect benefits accruing to them because of their whiteness. For, as he puts it, quote, while they received a low wage, they were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage, unquote. So this claim has received special attention in whiteness studies, in race scholarship, as promoted most famously by people like Charles Mills, David Roediger, and most recently, Ella Myers. But I think what none of these scholars notice, and this is striking, is that the actual passage in which the famous claim appears in Black Reconstruction is actually a larger description of what Du Bois calls, quote, a determined psychology of caste, and refers to as part of this larger post-Civil War development by which, quote, caste was revived in a modern civilized land, unquote. So what this oversight reflects, I think, is that while race scholars today continue to benefit a great deal from Du Bois's core insights, they also alienate these ideas from the broader theory of caste in the United States that he was self-consciously developing. So we could, in general, speculate as to why this might be the case. But what I want to do here is suggest why I think Du Bois might have thought it would be meaningful to talk about caste in the United States in the first place. And here I think there are at least three kinds of reasons that are worth exploring. So there's first historical reasons, second rhetorical ones, and then finally theoretical ones. So first, historically speaking, Du Bois squarely situated his own identity and life's work as part of a tradition of Black men who, beyond being race leaders, were also caste theorists. So these were Black abolitionists like William Cooper Nell, Charles Redmond, Alexander Crummell, and of course, Frederick Douglass, who was arguably the most influential figure in this particular tradition. Each in their own way, these thinkers sought to combat slavery and racial inequality in the United States by teaching the American public that their society, despite the liberal principles announced in their Declaration of Independence and Constitution, remained a caste system through and through. More broadly, and because of these thinkers' impacts, the archives of the abolitionist movement, so their convention records, newspapers, personal correspondences, propagandistic works of literature and the like, things explored in the book project, contain frequent references to American caste. For this movement, it seems caste was a term that simultaneously captured the denial of legal process, generally the recognition of Black rights in the courts and outside the courts, racial segregation in schools, churches, and public accommodations, and the psychic and material stings of racial discrimination and prejudice. In talking about the United States as a caste system, thus, Du Bois was continuing a project that his forebears had started decades before his birth. It was 1868, I think. But why then had these predecessors thought about the United States this way? Well, in part, there's an important point about language here. So today we would be likely or inclined perhaps to talk about these practices as examples of racism, or perhaps even systemic or institutional racism, or perhaps even racial capitalism. But in the 19th and early 20th centuries, these terms were not at all part of the public lexicon. So if you, for example, make a search in Google Books Ngram, what you'll see is that racism, the term, only really begins to enter the general use toward the end of the 1930s. So shortly after Du Bois publishes Black Reconstruction, and the book itself, incidentally, doesn't use the term racism. So what we could draw from this are at least two important inferences. One being that prior to the 1930s, racial justice activists used a different set of terms to capture phenomena that today code as racism, and caste was one of the important terms that they used. Second, the idea that caste should be understood would be the idea that caste should be understood as part of the history of theorizing anti-Black racism in the United States. So conceptually speaking, before we had racism as a concept or term, we had caste. Now, these inferences speak to history, but the rhetorical power of the term surely also contributed to its popularity in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So here there are at least two ways to think about the discursive effects that caste might have had in racial justice advocacy. So first, I would suggest caste offered its users a way to push reform by stigmatizing and shaming. So within the popular imaginary of 19th century America, caste was firmly associated with a set of sort of common sense prejudices and theories about other areas of the world, places like India, feudal France, Egypt, China, and Russia. And these imagined regions, fictional and fantastic though they were, offered Americans an essential constitutive outside against which they could conceptualize the United States as a Christian, capitalist, and Republican nation. These figments of American identity became fodder for racial justice advocates who, by encouraging the American public to see their nation as a caste system, could motivate social reform by revealing the extent to which the nation was lacking substantial modification, precisely its own other. Second, the same critique was powerful because it enabled racial justice advocates to cultivate a sense of global solidarity with those combating oppression in distant regions. With the concept of caste, abolitionists and later civil rights activists could say that they were engaged in a common contest, one shared by oppressed peoples throughout the globe, against the hereditary privileges of nobility, monarchical absolutism, and the degradations and toils of slavery and servitude. So together, these points of history and rhetoric help us understand why Du Bois and the larger tradition of Black activism in which he worked were inclined to think in terms of caste. At the same time, though, we should resist reducing these intellectual contributions to a mere battle of words. For this tradition, as I want to now turn to show, the concept of caste was important because it actually fit the conditions typifying racial capitalism in the United States during the 19th and 20th centuries. By looking at Du Bois's Black Reconstruction, we can see why, to his mind, first, caste described slavery, and second, why it also grasped the form of racial domination took as it emerged in the post-emancipation period as well. So first, chattel slavery as caste. One reason that Du Bois may have thought it made good sense to talk about race-based chattel slavery as caste is that it was appropriate for the kind of slavery that appeared in the American context. So first, slavery in the colonies became, though it did not begin this way, a system of hereditary labor. While scholars of slavery define the phenomenon in a variety of different ways, some, with Orlando Patterson being perhaps the most influential, argue that all slavery has an inherent hereditary dimension. For Patterson, one of the constituent elements of slavery, and the claim here is meant to apply to slavery not only in the US, but as such, is what's called natal alienation. Patterson argues that to be enslaved is to be, quote, socially dead, or, quote, alienated from all rights or claims of birth. So he argues that the child of any enslaved person would also necessarily be enslaved because the parents would have no rights or property to pass on, thus rendering the child as rightless as the parents themselves. So I think while this is compelling in some ways, it makes somewhat less sense actually in the American context as applied to the history of the institution of chattel slavery. So consider that for decades, enslaved people of African descent were able, with varying degrees of success, to sue for freedom after officially abandoning their native religions for Christianity. Indeed, for Ira Berlin, a leading historian of American slavery, putting an end to these what were called freedom suits was a key reason that Virginia in the 1660s became the first colony to adopt laws requiring the heritable transmission of slavery. Only from that point on would the heritable status of slavery become a common feature of the colonial slave codes. These were laws that simultaneously enforced the norm that slavery was exclusively a status for people of African descent. On Du Bois's telling of this history, however, it would not be for at least another century, so between 1750 and 1800, that the colonists would truly ground their, quoting Du Bois, systemic slave code on a distinct idea of social caste. And just to note, this bit here is just borrowed from an 1898 talk that Du Bois has, so a good deal earlier than Black Reconstruction. But as he explains there, these 18th century laws responded to a growing and increasingly insurrectionary population of free people of color. And by this, and here's a quote, denying the right of baptism, establishing the legal presumption that all Black and mixed race people were slaves, and finally changing the slave code to a Black code, replacing a caste of condition by a caste of race. So by caste of condition, what Du Bois means here, I think, is the 17th century codes that made slavery a heritable status, whereas by caste of race, what he means is these new 18th century laws, which made slavery an exclusively Black heritable status. So the story that he's describing, thus, is how slavery became caste, and then decades later, caste became racialized. But eventually, as we know, the old chattel system was abolished. So what happened to caste? Having shown why Du Bois thought the slave system was a caste system, I now want to say something about why he believed the post-emancipation condition of racial subjection was ultimately a caste system too, or ultimately sustained caste. So Jim Crow as caste. Today, race scholars often debate whether present-day racial inequality in the United States is best understood as a break from or an extension of the chattel system of the 19th century. In Black Reconstruction, Du Bois asks similar questions. The answer he provides is that emancipation not only involved the substitution of one form of slavery for another, but also that it entailed the further evolution of the American caste system. So I now want to read to you a brief passage from his book, which appears at the end of its second chapter, and I think provides a kind of elegant expression of the work's general narrative. So he writes, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. The whole weight of America was thrown to color caste. The colored world went down before England, France, Germany, Russia, Italy, and America. A new slavery arose. The upward moving of white labor was betrayed into wars of profit based on color caste. Democracy died save in the hearts of Black folk. Indeed, the plight of the white working class throughout the world today is directly traceable to Black slavery in America, on which modern commerce and industry was founded and which persisted to threaten free labor until it was partially overthrown in 1863. The resulting color caste, founded and retained by capitalism, was adopted, forwarded, and approved by white labor, and resulted in subordination of colored labor to white profits the world over. Thus, the majority of the world's laborers, by insistence of white labor, became the basis of a system of industry which ruined democracy and showed its perfect fruit in World War and Depression." This passage summarizes some of the principal endeavors of Black Reconstruction to explain how, despite the monumental efforts of African Americans and their allies, the combined weight of capitalism and white supremacy crushed the prospect of racial equality the world over. This failure for Du Bois is marked by the emergence of a new kind of slavery and a reformulation of the American caste system. It is unmistakable, I think, that one of the major changes to which Du Bois is referring in this passage is the integration of a previously enslaved population of Black Americans into a free labor system, or the subsumption of chattel slavery by wage slavery. And given what we know about caste, or color caste, as Du Bois puts it, we might think that it would be difficult to maintain a system of caste and free labor together, that they'd be at odds. So how could hereditary divisions possibly be maintained under a system that has replaced its slave codes and Black codes by formalizing free and equal market relations? If someone can choose their path, how could it possibly make sense to talk of rights, standing, and vocation as distributed on the principle of inheritance? Du Bois addresses these questions in the penultimate chapter of Black Reconstruction, the chapter containing his famous Wages of Whiteness theory. There he offers a lengthy discussion that unpacks the reasons he sees the Jim Crow society of racial segregation as a caste system, just like the chattel system had been before. But Du Bois's understanding of Jim Crow diverges in important ways from the ways in which white Americans are often still taught about it today. Never about, quote, mere race separation, Du Bois cautions. Jim Crow was always about, quote, domination of Blacks by white officials, white police and laws, and ordinances made by white men, unquote. The promulgation of racially segregated schools, transportation, and housing entailed the determination of Black education by white officials, the overtaxation of the Black population for second-rate services, and their ultimate confinement to neighborhoods and housing that failed to meet basic standards of health and safety. Reinforcing this new form of racial domination, Du Bois emphasizes, was the, quote, psychology of caste I mentioned earlier, or the view that, quote, as he defines it, the most educated and deserving Black man must be compelled in many public places to occupy a place beneath the lowest and least deserving of the whites, unquote. With this mentality, he continues, quote, went widespread and determined exploitation of Black labor, unquote, to the extent that it became, quote, the policy of the state to keep the Black laborer poor, to confine him as far as possible to menial occupations, to make him a surplus labor reservoir, and to force him into peonage and unpaid toil, unquote. For him and some, Jim Crow and its panoply of associated racial harms was ultimately not about separation, but about racial caste, the confinement of African Americans to society's lowest divisions of labor and honor. Further, recall the global aspirations from the narrative, from the passage I read a moment ago. When Du Bois speaks of color caste, he means something broader than a particular moment in the development of American society. With the First World War in mind, thus, he argues that, quote, imperialism rests based upon, quote, the determination of the white world to keep the black world poor and themselves rich, unquote. So the caste of color he's envisioning and critiquing is a worldwide phenomenon, a pervasion and a perversion of global capitalism. So this takes us to considering caste today. So hopefully to this point, I've convinced you that it made a great deal of sense in Du Bois's time to think about the United States as a caste system. And in this third and final portion of the talk, which will close us out, I want to suggest that it still makes sense to think about the United States as a caste system today. That is, as long as we are still thinking about it in Du Boisian terms rather than, say, Wilkersonian terms. Wilkerson, you'll recall, argues that the world is and always has been trapped within a caste system understood as a hierarchy of values sunk deep within the popular psyche. In Du Bois, by contrast, and as we've now seen, caste is a hereditary division of labor, one that survives dramatic changes to the mode of production, even as it is transformed by them. In the contemporary United States, it's unfortunately clear that labor continues to be arranged in just this way. For evidence, we can look at such sources as the distribution of jobs as recorded by the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, the distribution of social mobility as analyzed by economists like Raj Chetty, and the numerous so-called gaps in wealth, health, education, and the like, which are plainly pointed out in a voluminous body of recent social scientific research. Now, for different reasons, these inequalities are based on birth. For one, they're correlated closely with race. Consider, for example, Chetty's important data on racial distributions of social mobility. In a 2019 paper, Chetty shows that in the United States, African Americans and indigenous people experience far higher rates of downward mobility and far lower rates of upward mobility than their white, Hispanic, and Asian identifying peers. He shows that today, that is, the Black and indigenous people in the US are more likely than not to live out their lives within the same class and life circumstances to which they were born, if not ultimately ones that are worse. And consider that one way to unpack this inference is to note that people born today into these communities are likely to be presented with limited job opportunities. They may not be compelled to do the same work as their parents, but in many cases, they may also not be permitted to engage in the kind of work that would enable them to transcend theirs and their parents' classes. It may not, in circumstances, matter how skilled an individual member of these communities is, for the way that societies are organized will still be highly prohibitive of social advancement. This, I want to say, is part of the immense crime of our society's racial caste system. We can also think about contemporary caste from another angle. Consider that a society without caste would be one in which one's birth conditions are not at all predictive of one's eventual role in the process of social reproduction. By such a standard, virtually everyone today is overdetermined by caste, because everyone is overdetermined by class. In capitalism, as the sociologist Kenneth Green argues, society's overall social mobility is basically an afterthought to its underlying level of technological process. It's a side effect of relatively more tectonic changes in the mode of production. Thus, in moments when technological development stalls, capitalist societies might be expected to be more caste-like, or to have their caste character appear more resolutely. By contrast, during moments of great technological transformation, for instance, when a society becomes more productive or issues new ways of working, ties linking birth and social role may loosen. During these moments, a society's caste character may seem to dissolve. It may seem, in other words, as though individuals are more capable of choosing their place in the great division of labor. While Du Bois's way of thinking can help us consider caste in these more general terms, however, it's especially illuminating when we think about racial caste today. What his work attunes us to is that from generation to generation and in different ways, opportunities for Black upward mobility in the United States have been denied, and that they largely continue to be so in present day. In other words, it encourages us to think about the problem of enduring racial inequality in precisely the terms that Wilkerson's way of doing caste theory observes, that is, through the categories of race and class. To say that there exists a hereditary division of labor based on race is to say that race and class, though distinct phenomena, are also substantially merged. With this in mind, I think it may be important to consider reframing our understanding of the historical development of race theory in the United States too. In Wilkerson's case, doing caste theory today might look like the pouring of old wine into new casks. Caste seems like a flashy new term imported from abroad to entice a new generation of race theory consumption. Well, in a historical perspective, oddly enough, I think this critique may apply more to theories like racial capitalism than it does to caste. Indeed, it was the former that only in recent years became part of the American lexicon, the latter being, as we have now seen, part of American political theory from basically the outset. But at the risk of pushing the metaphor, the changing of casks may also change the flavor of the wine, or whatever is in there. This is to say that for Du Bois, the concept of caste highlighted a problem to which theorists of racial capitalism have not, at least yet, given much attention, which is the unequal distribution of social mobility. For him, thus, the end of color caste, though not necessarily the end of caste as such, would entail the equalization of social mobility across the races within and beyond the United States. In other words, it conjures the image of color caste abolition as the achievement of racially just capitalism. But herein, I think in the final analysis, may lie the principal danger of caste theorization for us. Both historically and today, caste theory has sometimes served as a defense of capitalism's wildest promises of equality, liberty, and the like. Still, I want to say this danger is one that is ultimately limited to or determined by the specific theorist far more than it is by the concept of caste as such. So color caste, to allow Du Bois's words to echo once more, was, quote, founded and retained by capitalism, was adopted and forwarded and approved by white labor, and resulted in subordination of colored labor to white profits the world over, unquote. By refusing to sever the idea of an American caste system from the histories of slavery and race, Du Bois challenges us to ask whether, and if so how, capitalism might admit of conditions under which caste is once and for all destroyed. And what would be dangerous indeed would be to fail to see these questions through. Thank you.